All right, so let's wrap up our discussion of privacy, chapter 13 in Griffin's on Human Rights. Some final considerations. Um, all right, so we're looking at the notion of the extension of the term normative agent is going to apply, exactly that to those people who have, this autonomy, this liberty, and the ability, right, as we've seen, to have a well-conceived, conceptualized notion and evaluated notion of a good life, and have the capacity to pursue it. Human rights protects that. But there's lots of us that fall outside of this, and we've seen Griffin talk about like babies and children are not normative agents in that sense. But of course, they're protected; they have moral significance, but not necessarily, protected. This giving them grounds of human rights, but they're still morally significant. So remember, human rights does not exhaust the domain of moral significance by any stretch, right? And in this one here, we have others, those with advanced dementia, right? They are outside of the boundary of normative agents, but certainly they would have privacy too. We talk about that. They would, merit respect and moral significance, and they have a dignity as well. Now, Griffin is saying, well, sure, to all of that, yes, but just the notion of having dignity, because he's talked about this earlier. This is a very vague term. You find it in all kinds of international treaties, and it's largely been left uninterpreted. Right? In other words, you say, okay, we had this agreement that all human beings have a sense of dignity, or an intrinsic sense of dignity, and rights and human rights flow out of those. That's a very unclear inference. Why? Because the notion of dignity is left undefined. And of course, if you leave a fundamental predicate or a property undefined and then you derive things from it, your whole process has, it's pretty cloudy, right? What are you making those inferences on if the terms that you use as your basis for an inference are intrinsically, at least as far as the conversation goes, unclear? But there's no question that in these cases, right, we can talk about some sense of dignity. We might say that we have an obligation. We can generate the notion of, and a fairly well-defined one, of a notion of obligation. We could say a duty of respect, but we could also put that as a bedrock term. We might say something like, well, someone who's had who is in the current stages of advanced dementia, we have an obligation to respect that current individual for the full person that they once were, and that's a fundamental. Just like we have, we talk about respect for the dead, the fallen in war, all these kinds of things. We don't necessarily argue for them. We put the burden of proof on those who resist them. So something like saying like, well, why wouldn't you respect the dead or honor those who have fallen? Or why would, the burden of the proof of the argument is on the other side. Like we're going to think it as a primitive or a basis kind of claim that there is an obligation to respect those in this situation for the persons that they once were. That's a primitive. I'm not going to unpack that any further. That's where the dignity question kind of bottoms out into a fundamental obligation. And we could say that, again, the burden of the argument's on the other side. And we might even go further, and we often do. I mean, and this is sometimes a matter of quote unquote polite society, is we regard it as kind of fundamentally distasteful if people don't see the obligation, or if someone behaviorally rejects it and does something that we would say dishonors. We would find that deeply offensive and regard the person who does that as something in the sense of having maybe defective in some way, or like Griffin says, having corrupted or defective feelings, like, or you're callous or insensitive, or the normal thing would be to be sensitive to this and to honor someone. So in this state, or to honor the dead, or to honor someone who is in advanced state of dementia. But it wouldn't necessarily fall under the human rights thing. But that clearly, again, does not mean that the person that is there, in whatever sense we want to argue about the nature of the person that's there, still merits respect and honor and has dignity. and again, this is a discussion more of appropriate behavior, but this is not sufficient to generate a human right. But again, fine. So what? It's still a question of appropriate and moral behavior. Now, what about another final consideration is the peeping Tom. The peeping Tom that is not seen or whatever, peeps and then disappears or whatever. That hasn't actually inhibited the agents, the victims, the agents' autonomy, right? Not necessarily. So do we want to say that that's okay, or there hasn't been a dignity violated? Griffin wants to kind of put the brakes on that conclusion because he says, we're going to be protected from typically damaging exposures, and he generates that because that's linked to society. So typically, just like we saw in the informational privacy that discussion, that statistically it's possible, empirically possible, that someone can be completely exposed and they function as a normal agent, but that's not typical, right? And we shouldn't reject the notion of a human right simply on the basis that we can find exceptions where that's violated and a person proceeds happily along with their normative agency, right? Some people just psychologically are structured that they can function in full glare, that there'd be some people that it's not an issue, but we shouldn't take those hard cases to and use them as a basis of induction and say, well, then the peeping Tom is no violation there. No, Griffin says that it's typically damaging, and that's typically linked to society. It might be the case that certain things that were damaging at one time might not be at others, so they may not fall under the protection of a human right, or something that's damaging at one time and is a violation of a human right may not, as society changes, be as damaging, right? Because society just, certain things, if something was illegal at one time and you're exposed doing it, that could be extremely damaging. But if it's legalized and whatever, and society's values change, being exposed is not a big deal anymore. So you still have a right to not be exposed, but maybe that one, it doesn't fall as a violation of it. So things can change. And again, this is all part of Griffin's notion that human rights are not absolutely fixed, right? The shape of them is determined, again, by a lot of their contours, and by the practicalities and social situations. Okay, so overall, Griffin says that there's the upshot of all this is that the privacy of the personal space and life is indeed important. He's not denying that. But he thinks alone it's not enough to generate a human right. But it doesn't mean that we say that the privacy of the personal space is not important. Okay, that's true. But it is linked in importance to informational privacy. In other words, the privacy of the personal space and life, which I'm going to indicate by this little asterisk, is instrumentally linked to informational privacy by signifying that by gamma. Because why? What does that mean? Well, if you have no protection for this personal space and life, if you say, oh, there's no value, no protection to it, right? If you make that, which Griffin doesn't think you should, but if you say it has no value at all, right, then that's going to damage and threaten informational privacy, as he says. Well, if there's no real protection of the space of one space, then it could be damaging. So authorities could just waltz into your home if that's not protected as a physical space. That's going to eventually have repercussions. And to say something like, well, you could empirically to say, well, the authorities could come in my home. That's not necessarily damaging to my autonomy. But then you would have to be saying things like, yeah, sure, the authorities would come in my home and they're not likely to do anything more than just look around and leave. That's highly unrealistic. So in that sense, we have an instrumental connection so that it's empirically and it's logically possible to have this violation of this space in life without a corresponding violation of your informational privacy. But that is extremely unlikely. Again, it's the statistical type of thinking that statistically, if this is not protected, then it's going to be very likely that this is going to be threatened. And this is something we do put inside of a human right. And so instrumentally, the personal space protection gets in there as part of informational privacy, not as a completely separate human right on its own. So in other words, the value of this here hangs on the value of that. So this one is arguably kind of parasitic on it. But nonetheless, that's extremely important because it's sort of the first line of defense of the inner citadel is this immediate externalized citadel. If you don't have a moat and a drawbridge, then the castle's in trouble. So this is kind of like the moat and the drawbridge, which is not intrinsically valuable because the enemy could take it. But if the enemy takes your moat and your drawbridge, they're going to take the castle, right? What are the odds of that? So you build a moat and castle, or you build a moat and a drawbridge to protect the castle. You can think of it something like that. And again, the inner citadel, that's what we're protecting the most here, because liberty doesn't mean anything outside of that. All right. So in the end, there is, and liberty, of course, is going to be protected in the general sense, not through a privacy thing, right? Just simply a human right to liberty. So we protect privacy, the privacy right, the human right of privacy protects the inner citadel. And as we go out and we take that little space around with us, that's not a privacy protection, that's a liberty protection. So a human right of liberty works with the human right of informational privacy, and we should keep the two separate. And then you get that personal space, shall we say, that immediate castle, that's protected with provisos, because remember, that space could be distorted through a patriarchal distortion. So with provisos, these externalized spaces are protected. But again, it could be the public interest in both of them, depending on what's actually going on. But the mind itself, that's completely free. Think whatever you want. But again, that's now come up as a philosophical discussion too. But traditionally, and in Griffin's discussion, the mind is the complete free zone. Okay, and shouldn't be and shouldn't be coerced in any way. The only way you can influence people with respecting their freedom, of course, this is a Kantian idea, is through rational discussion. I can attempt to get you to change your mind, not by force, not by coercion, but through rational persuasion. In that sense, I'm respecting you as a subject and an autonomous agent by using logic and argument. All right. But things, again, like wiretapping and all that stuff, definitely that falls under informational privacy. And so you can get all those things, like, and of course the walls of your house, like you can't put listening devices and all that, but those things are wrong because they will eventually be a violation of informational privacy, right? So because, again, it's the notion that if they're listening, they can use that against you in some way and eventually be influential and destructive of your autonomy. All right. So Griffin then looks at a number of things outside of privacy considerations and informational privacy, like nuisance noises, attacks on honor and reputation. He thinks these are not really human rights. These are a matter of tort law. So if like a noise bylaw or something like that, there's no human right there. It's tort law. If you want to talk about harms and security of the person, bodily integrity, these are not issues of privacy. Even the right to self-determination of the body and things like that. These are encapsulated by liberty, not privacy. Now, the last issue that he discusses is, well, if there's a human right to informational privacy, can that clash with the right to information, the need to function in that sense? If my government doesn't give me information that I need in order to be autonomous and make good judgments, let's say in a democracy, yeah, you could say that my human right to information has been compromised, and the government doesn't have some sort of right to informational privacy. So there's a great power of the right to know, but not every denial of information is a human rights violation. Griffin gives the example of a local newspaper doesn't publish the soccer scores or something like that, and I'm denied that information. Well, my human rights haven't been violated. So there's lots of cases where I can be denied information, and it's not a human rights violation. So we have to be very clear what kind of right to know we're talking about. And this, of course, it forces us to refine a public-private distinction too. And why? Because we think about politicians, think about judges, and all these people who are in positions of power. What do we say about their private lives when we talk about, people who go and make their living in the public sphere? Do they forfeit all their private lives? Does the public's right to know, like if you get into a position of power, does my right to know everything about you sort of trump your informational privacy? Griffin thinks that's nonsense, right? The media, he thinks, has largely tried to push that line and say, well, everything's relevant. If somebody wants to be a prime minister or a president or a judge, everything's up for grabs about their character because their character is in power. And if we want to understand their character, we have the right to know about their character. And so we have the right to know everything. He says, that's nonsense. Why does he say that? Well, because we have a right to know when someone's running for office, yeah, about their character, but not everything about their character. Their character as a leader, and their character as a leader may not include absolutely everything about them. And again, the standard example about things like sexual orientation. That's irrelevant in the sense of someone's private life in that dimension of their character, right? That is part of their character, part of who they are, but that's not relevant to running a municipality or a province or a state, right? Or being a judge. Now, and that's very interesting because, that forces us to think more clearly about the public-private distinction, like what is relevant. So when people do make their living in the public space, how much do they owe the public? Like if they get great responsibility through democracy or some kind of appointment, how much does a person, when they're being vetted for a position of power, how much does the public need to know or have a right to know? And so we need to think about this more carefully and go on a case-by-case basis, and eventually we can come up with a better understanding of the public-private distinction, rather than just saying it's radically separate all the time or it's never separate. It's going to be on a case-by-case basis. But Griffin says, in the end, X's right to informational privacy is not necessarily going to clash, even in positions of power, with the right to information by the public. But of course, that opens up another issue, which Griffin doesn't discuss, which is very interesting, is, what are characters when we talk about human characters? Is it true that we can talk about predicates of a human character that are deeply important to that person, but they're able to set them aside, like maybe deeply held cultural beliefs or religious beliefs, and then they get into a position of power and they can say, oh no, that doesn't influence me at all. But it's a deep part of the character. So this, again, raises interesting questions about what is the nature of a truly autonomous subject. But Griffin, says in the end, he doesn't take a really firm position. He says it's not the case that maybe some of these very, important things like, sexual orientation or whatever are absolutely never relevant. Maybe they are, but we can't really say in advance. But nearly all the time he's saying it really isn't. But nonetheless, it does open up the question of privacy and rights, informational privacy does raise questions about how people possess their properties, how they possess their beliefs, not what their beliefs are, but how they possess them and how they think and how much those beliefs influence what they think, or if there are these abilities to simply set them aside. Is that possible? Interesting stuff. In any case, that brings the chapter 13 to a close. See you next video.